So for the past week and a half or so, you've been reading texts by two medieval writers. The first one is the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who is sort of considered in our very sort of patriarchal, paternalistic society, the father, as it were, of Italian Renaissance literature, and really the fathers of modern Western literature as a whole. His most famous work, as you may remember from the introductory handout that you read, was the Decameron, which is a story about a group of nobles who, to flee the plague that was ravaging Florence in the Middle Ages, fled to a nearby castle on a hill, sort of away from all the proles who were dying of the plague. And they told stories to pass the time. And each person on the in the castle on the trip told 10 stories. So 10 stories, 10 people is 100 stories. The other author whose work you've been reading, whose image is actually on the far left, was the French medieval writer and theorist Christine de Pizan. We've been thinking about the writings of these two authors through the lens of feminist theory. Now, as I mentioned before, feminist theory was not a concept for at least another 400 years, 400 to 500 years. The term feminism actually starts to be used in the late 1800s. Boccaccio, is writing in the 1300s, and Christine de Pizan is writing in the 1400s. So the term feminism would not have existed back then. If you had asked these two writers about feminism, they would have looked at you quizzically because it didn't exist. However, we're actually looking backwards at these texts through a feminist lens. And ultimately, you're going to be answering the question whether Chaucer was a feminist or not. So actually, we're using the works of Christine de Pizan and Giovanni Boccaccio to sort of shed some light on Chaucer's own relationship to feminist theory. So by this point, you've read selections from Boccaccio's Famous Women, which, as you'll recall, is a series of biographies he wrote of famous women, both mythical and not, in which they're largely said to be anti-feminist. Now, of course, anti-feminism looks different in different contexts. So, for example, a feminist critic would argue that it is anti-feminist or misogynist to disparage women or as weak or as unable to do things that men can, but it's also anti-feminist and misogynistic to ascribe everything good to women. This idea, think about going back to the sonnet that you learned about, this idea that women are untouchable, that they're pure, that they can't be sullied by the everyday concerns of working or having their own money, and that sort of thing. So most would argue that Boccaccio is an anti-feminist writer, but again, anti-feminism is not just insulting women. In some cases, it can be holding women to an unrealistic standard. Christine de Pizan is more or less known as the first feminist writer in the Western tradition, and it's because she actually made it a point to undo what Boccaccio did in Famous Women. Her book, which is called The Book of the City of Ladies, was an active attempt to right the wrongs that she felt Boccaccio had done to women when he wrote the biographies of these women. And she takes as sort of the structure of her book pretty much Boccaccio's Famous Women. She adds a prologue in which she's visited by these three spirits, and they tell her, you must fix what Boccaccio did, you must rescue the reputation of these women. Now, so you've been reading these stories over the past week or so, and we're actually going to focus on one particular set of stories, and that's going to be, we're going to look at Eve, the Boccaccio's version and de Pizan's version. We're going to talk about gathering evidence for exactly what makes either one of their depictions of Eve feminist or anti-feminist. You're going to be writing a short paper, sort of a paragraph as it were, on Wednesday, in which you're going to be asked which author is the feminist and which the anti-feminist. And the question here is not which is which. I've just told you which is which. And I'm sure you have gathered by this point which is which. So we're not actually so much worrying about interpretation right now. We're going to be worrying on evidence gathering. Worrying about evidence gathering. All right. So this little mini lesson is going to be talking about how to look through these texts and find evidence of Boccaccio's anti-feminism and Christine de Pizan's relative feminism. So you're going to want to go and look at your texts, your Boccaccio and de Pizan texts. So I'm going to click over to that right now. So here are the texts that we posted to the Google Classroom the texts from Boccaccio's Famous Women and Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies. And we're going to start, as I mentioned, with Eve, as I scroll up here. And we're going to talk about Boccaccio first. So the idea is that you're going to tell us, you're going to argue that Boccaccio is either a feminist or is not. All right, and I just mentioned he was not. So we're actually going to comb through Eve, and we're going to see what we can find in terms of what we could call anti-feminist rhetoric or anti-feminist diction. Diction, of course, is the literary term. It means word choice. So what are the words that Boccaccio chooses that give us the sense that he's an anti-feminist? All right, so we're going to read through this. I'm actually going to read this aloud. You're going to follow along. And along the way, as herky-jerky as it may seem, I'm going to stop and point out what I think are some words and phrases that Boccaccio uses that could sort of reveal him to be the anti-feminist that I've already said he is. So, Eve, our first mother. As I'm going to write about the glories for which women have become famous, it will not seem inappropriate to begin with the mother of us all. She is the most ancient of mothers, and at first she was singled out for special honors. She was not brought forth in this wretched vale of misery in which the rest of us are born to labor. She was not wrought with the same hammer or anvil. She did not come into life like others, either weak or tearfully bewailing original sin. Instead, and this never happened to anyone else so far as I know, after the most excellent creator of all things had formed Adam from earthly clay with his own hand, and had taken him from the field later called Damascene to the garden of delights, he made Adam fall into peaceful slumber, with a skill only known to himself. God brought forth a woman from Adam's side as he lay sleeping, adult, ripe for marriage, joyful at the beauty of the place and at the sight of her maker. She was also the immortal mistress of nature and the companion of the man who now awake named her Eve. Now I'll take a pause here for a moment. There's not too much here, but a feminist critic would be very interested in this term ripe for marriage. So you may, if you have this in front of you, you may want to highlight this term ripe for marriage. Right? The idea is that Eve was created from Adam's rib, as it were, for the express purpose of marriage. Right? So Eve herself is not a sort of standalone woman with self-agency, meaning that can act for herself. She's simply an object of marriage. Right? And by the way, my goal here is not to sort of contravene church teaching. We're looking at these as literary texts, and no one is arguing how you should or shouldn't look at Eve. But if we're speaking about feminist theory from a more literary and more academic standpoint, a feminist critic would be intrigued by Boccaccio's use of ripe for marriage. And there is nothing in Genesis, the book of Genesis, which is where Eve is mentioned, that calls her ripe for marriage. This is Boccaccio's spin. So I would highlight this as some sort of anti-feminist diction. Again, there's nothing insulting here. Just the idea that all she was made for is marriage. All right. Notice too that she's spoken in terms of beauty. Right. Another interesting linkage that between women that's often made is between women and nature. Right? Women are the sort of the earth mothers, and this also, of course, is a holdover from pagan theology before the Semitic religions came about in what is now Palestine. So the idea that she's ripe for marriage, she's beautiful, right? And even though it doesn't say she herself is beautiful, beauty is mentioned. So it's not ironic that beauty and Eve are mentioned in the same sentence, or at least the implication of beauty. All right, let's move on. Could anything greater and more glorious ever happen to someone at birth? You can imagine besides how marvelously beautiful her body was, for whatever God creates with his own hand will certainly surpass anything else in beauty. Again, he's not going to mention Adam's beauty, but just Eve's. Back to the text. Beauty, to be sure, perishes with old age, and even in the flower of youth it may vanish from a slight attack of illness. Yet since women count a beauty among their foremost endowments and have achieved, owing to the superficial judgment of mortals, much glory on that account, it will not seem excessive to place beauty here and in the following pages as the most dazzling aspect of their fame. So he basically says here, everyday people sort of are focusing on beauty, which is silly. However, I'm going to do the same thing. Right? So again, it will not seem excessive to place beauty here and in the following pages as the most dazzling aspect. All right? So again, he's not insulting Eve, but it's interesting that he's speaking about her only in terms of how she looks. Adam is never described as being handsome. Right? So that would be considered an anti-feminist, a bit of anti-feminist rhetoric. All right? So here's some diction in here, some words and phrases that would imply that Boccaccio, while subtly, would be an anti-feminist. Moving on. Eve, furthermore, became a citizen of paradise as much by right of origin as of residence, and she was cloaked in a radiance unknown to us. While she and her husband were eagerly enjoying the garden's pleasures, the enemy, envious of her happiness, impressed upon her with perverted eloquence the belief that she could attain greater glory if she disobeyed the one law that God had laid upon her. And by the way, Boccaccio assumes you know this, and that is when God told Adam and Eve, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All right, here's where it gets much more blatantly anti-feminist. With a woman's fickleness, Eve believed him more than was good for her or for us. Foolishly, she thought that she was about to rise to greater heights. All right, so here's this blatantly anti-feminist term: fickleness. Right? Women, in other words, women are changeable. They're too easily persuaded. Right? And they go back and forth. If someone is fickle, it means they go back and forth too much between different ideas or really different people. First, we'll return to the text. Her first step was to flatter her pliant husband into her way of thinking. Pliant meaning easily molded. So she's going to use her feminine wiles to kind of snooker Adam into doing what he shouldn't do. Then they broke the law and tasted the apple of the tree of good and evil. By this rash, foolhardy act, they brought themselves and their future descendants from peace and immortality to anxious labor and wretched death, and from a delightful country to thorns, clods, and rocks. So notice here again, it's Eve's fault, in a way. Her first step was to flatter her pliant husband. She started this, right? She flatters her husband into doing the wrong thing. Now, not in Boccaccio's defense, but to, I guess, sort of argue for him for a moment, he does implicate them both, right? But Eve, and it's not an accident she's called our first mother, is the first person here who is implicated, ultimately, for this crime. All right. The gleaming light, going back to the text, the gleaming light which closed them disappeared. Rebuked by their angry creator and covered by a girdle of leaves, they were driven out of Eden and came as exiles to the field of Hebron. There, while her husband tilled the soil with the hoe, this distinguished woman, which is an interesting sort of, in a way, backhanded compliment, famous for her above-mentioned deeds, discovered, so some believe, the art of spinning with the distaff, meaning she sewed, or she actually spun fibers into cloth, rather. She experienced the pains of frequent childbirth and also suffered the grief which tortures the mind at the death of children and grandchildren. Notice how Boccaccio does not associate Adam with grief. It is a woman's job now to feel emotions, right? And this may very well help explain why women in our society, even today, are the ones who are held to be the emotional ones and are actually allowed to have emotions, whereas men are not allowed to have them. Because here Adam is not allowed emotion. He's not even mentioned in any sort of emotional context. I shall pass over the cold and heat and her other sufferings. Finally she reached old age, tired out by her labors, waiting for death. All right? So the last word we get of Eve is death. And she is forever now associated with death because of the death of sort of the dream of living in the Garden of Eden. All right? So pointing out to some examples of some anti-feminist rhetoric in Eve. Now, Boccaccio is a good writer. Whether or not he's a misogynist or not, he is a good writer. And he's not as blatant as you might expect. He's not as blatant, for example, as the almost ridiculous poems you read the week before, in which women were blamed for just about everything and were sort of painted as victimizers of men. Boccaccio, being a prose stylist and a poet, is perhaps more subtle, but there's no denying that this is an anti-feminist track. So again, in this last paragraph here, we have some diction, some phrases that would reveal him to be an anti-feminist that I've pointed out. So there's Boccaccio. Now, Christina Pizan comes along, and she tries, as I mentioned, to right the wrongs of what Boccaccio did. And so here is her mention of Eve. Now she gets her own chapter of a sort, but it's not given a heading, which is interesting. It's almost as if Christina Pizan is saying that I don't have to necessarily defend the Eve, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, starting at the top where it says 1.9.3, the Book of the City of Ladies is broken out into sort of chapter, section, and then paragraph. All right? So, Pizan says of Eve, "My lady, according to what I understand from you, woman is a most noble creature. But even so, Cicero, who by the way is a Roman thinker and writer and philosopher, says that a man should never serve any woman, and that he who does so debases himself, for no man should ever serve anyone lower than him." Okay, and by the way, the person speaking is one of the three spirits that visits Pizan, and Pizan replies, "The man or the woman in whom resides greater virtue is the higher. Neither the loftier nor the lowliness of person of a person lies in the body according to the sex, but in the perfection and conduct of virtues. And surely he is happy who serves the Virgin, who is above all the angels. Now, essentially what she's saying is that whether someone is good or bad does not come with gender. In this case, she uses the term sex. All right. In other words, just because she's a woman does not mean that she's bad. So, in terms of looking for evidence that Christine de Pizan is a feminist writer, you would probably look to this line, right? Neither the loftiness nor the lowliness of a person lies in the body according to the sex. Right? Women are not good or bad just because of their gender and their bodies, just as men are never judged. They're never sort of held to be inherently evil or bad just because of their body parts, right? Whereas women are often attributed certain certain ways of acting and thinking and being because of the body parts they have, right? It almost goes to the classic argument that victims of assault often face when they say, well, you shouldn't have looked like that. You shouldn't have been wearing that, right? Well, it's not a woman's fault what she looks like, right? And so she's sort of, in a way, implying that here. So, the spirit says to her, my lady, one of the Catos, who is another, a couple men named Cato were philosophers in ancient Rome. My lady, one of the Catos, who was such a great orator, said, nevertheless, that if the world were without women, we would converse with the gods. Okay, so she's quoting another anti-feminist tract, another anti-feminist idea put forth by one of the philosophers named Cato back in the Roman period, right? Again, viciously anti-feminist. And you could almost argue that Pizan is sort of poking here Boccaccio, because Boccaccio, while he doesn't use these terms exactly, definitely sort of painted Eve in sort of a similar way as these other writers. So, she says, quote, you can now see the foolishness of the man who is considered wise, because, thanks to a woman, man reigns with God. And if anyone would say that man was banished because of Lady Eve, I tell you that he gained more through Mary than he lost through Eve, when humanity was conjoined to the Godhead, which would never have taken place if Eve's misdeed had not occurred. Now, this is a fascinating argument to make. And because one of the problems with Eve is that she did, according to Genesis, she did disobey God. God said, do not take that fruit, and she took it. Even though she was snookered by Lucifer in the form of a serpent, she did something wrong. She disobeyed. So what Christine de Pizan does here is that she flips the script a bit. So let's go back here. It says here, and if anyone would say that man was banished because of Lady Eve, I tell you that he gained more through Mary than he lost through Eve. Basically, what Christine de Pizan is arguing here is that when Adam and Eve were expelled from paradise, all right, that was called original sin. So when Adam and Eve eat the fruit, God expels them from paradise. He makes Adam till the land. He makes Eve bear children. It's called original sin. And according to the Catholic faith, we are born into original sin, right? Until we are cleansed of it, right, at baptism. And Christ was said to be born just for the express purpose of cleansing mankind of this sin. And of course, Mary is his mother, right? So basically, Pizan is arguing that without Eve, if Eve hadn't done what she did, Mary wouldn't have been necessary, and we never would have had Christ. So it's a truly fascinating, even bizarre argument to make. But she's really essentially making lemonade out of lemons, right? She's saying that if anyone would say that man was banished because of Eve, I tell you that he gained more through Mary than he lost through Eve. Okay, it was better that Eve did what she did so that we'd get the Virgin Mary. And you have to understand at this time, even though Mary is not allowed to be worshipped as a god, the cult of Mary was all over Europe and was about to make its way to the New World. So Mary was a very popular figure, and she was often asked to intercede for people. All right, so this would be a brilliant text to cite if you're trying to argue that Christine de Pizan is a feminist. She sort of relieves Eve of the burden of being the cause of the fall of mankind, and actually credits her with giving us the Virgin Mary and then God. All right, thus man and woman should be glad for this sin, through which such an honor has come about. Men and women should be glad that Eve sinned, because without Eve, again, there's no Mary and there's no Christ. For as low as human nature fell through this creature woman, i.e. Eve, was human nature lifted higher by the same creature. So in other words, a woman doomed us all, but then a woman saved us, right? A woman, Eve, made a huge mistake, right? But human nature was lifted by Eve's sin because we got Mary and Christ. It is one of the most brilliant arguments you will ever find in Western literature. And it's truly unexpected. And how, in a way, Christine de Pizan got away with it is beyond me. That would not have been considered a canonical idea, a canonical meaning accepted by many people. So I pointed out in Christine de Pizan's answer to Boccaccio how we could argue that she is a feminist writer. I've shown you some examples of textual evidence that you would cite if you were trying to argue that Christine de Pizan was a feminist writer, and I also showed you some text that would help you if you had to argue that Boccaccio was an anti-feminist writer. Now, on Wednesday, you're going to be writing a paper again in which you say you tell us which is the feminist and which is the anti-feminist. All right, not all that difficult in and of itself. The woman you're going to be using as the basis for this short paragraph is Semiramis, is the Assyrian queen Semiramis. So what I suggest you do is look particularly closely at Semiramis in your packet, and you'll see her. Here she is in Christine de Pizan, and she's further up in Boccaccio. So there she was in de Pizan, and here we have her in Boccaccio. And you will notice that what Boccaccio mentions of her and what Pizan mentions of her often coincide, but you'll notice the same differences between them. So now that I've shown you how to sort of gather evidence to support whether an author is anti-feminist or feminist, now you're going to gather that same evidence yourself with regard to Semiramis. Good luck.